So today I have the pleasure of speaking with Victor Wang, who is Artistic Director and Chief Curator of Beijing's M Woods Museum, which is focused on contemporary art from China and the rest of the world. He's also the founder of the Institute of Asian Performance Art, which dedicates itself to deepening the awareness and understanding of the history of early performance art in Japan, Korea, mainland China, and Taiwan. Wang has curated a variety of exhibitions for many different institutions in many different countries, has written criticism for a variety of art publications, delivered academic talks, and he also edited the 2018 volume Performance Victories from East Asia 1960s to 1990s. Victor, thank you so much for agreeing to answer our two questions, and here they are. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? If not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you for having me. And those are very big questions, but I'm honored to be here and to think through some of these questions with you. So your first question, can performance art be conserved? I'm going to just jump off the cliff and say no. However, I would also say that obviously in late capitalist museums, they can generally commodify anything these days. So I'm not surprised that with the commercialization of our institutions, that you will see these modes, these kind of four-dimensional modes of expression being compressed and reduced down to commercial standards into commodities that can be bought, sold, collected, and conserved. And you can actually see that development through technologies such as photography, and how photography influenced our understanding the ontology of live art and its reduction during the 1960s and 70s. But I would like to go deeper into this, because to me, how can museums actually collect something that they don't actually fully understand? How can you conserve the thing that you can't really fully grasp its entire properties or the language that we use to speak about it? So from my perspective, I have always wondered, in fact, what was the West's fascination with preservation and this idea of historicizing? And I know we could probably trace this back to Greece and to France, to the idea of the biblioteca. And I do know in my own research, I found that, a lot of European powers, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, did use this idea of an encyclopedic knowledge, this idea that would predicate the idea of an institution of all cultures, to actually form colonial powers and dominance over colonial people. They would use classification as a tool, categorization as a tool, to reinforce certain domination over people, culture, and certain types of world building. And so there's a cultural logic that I think one has to discuss. But let's discuss why I think it cannot be conserved or collected. Well, first of all, I would say that our bodies are not the same. And I'm speaking from a very specific context and perspective. So for example, when we founded the Institute of Asian Performance Art back around 2017-18, it was a challenge to institutional norms. It came out of an art historical dilemma. And it was a way of engaging with East Asia and a region, not as a place, not as a geographical place, but as a network of unique contexts that, when placed together, created a kind of counter-narrative expression, which was really important at the time, and I think still is. And it came to me when I was a young student, and I was bombarded by a very narrow art historical canon. So in terms of performance or live art, I tend to use certain analogies, and I'll use one now to help express what I'm trying to say. So for example, if we look at a famous work such as Yves Klein, Leap into the Void, that he did around 1960, and we compare that to, say, Shi Dexing's Jump piece from 1973, Shi Dexing being the Taiwanese American performance artist known for his long durational pieces. Well, the big difference is both of them jumped out of a window, right? However, we know that Yves Klein hired photographers to photo splice his jump so that he could jump safely onto a fabric, a kind of tarmac to break his fall. However, Shi Dexing jumped out the window of a 2 to 3 story building and broke both his legs. And I think this really gets to the core of what we're actually trying to talk about, because what are we actually trying to conserve? Because it's certainly not the performance, right? It's certainly not that 4-dimensional experience with flesh, sound, smell, and feeling of fear, excitement, and joy. And so within this conversation of collecting, conserving, and so on, East Asia, I have found, is often overlooked when we discuss the topic. And I find the topic is often discussed through a very Western-centric lens. And another great artist, such as Li Yufan, often speaks about the relationship, say, of the monoha art movement in Japan, and how the defeat of Japan during the Second World War actually affected a modernist form, or the development of a type of modernity, and from that, a type of avant-garde and live art. So what I'm trying to say here is, in the West, the artist makes the work, right? It's the artist that makes the art. But in the East, we might say it's the work that makes the artist, right? And in order to truly grasp this nuance, I believe, in live art in East Asia, I think we have to first posit that the very concepts at play, the particular properties that define the relationship between the individual and society, that some of these histories are not so easily canonized, and that each culture, I would say, again, has their own models of world building. For example, in East Asia, live art was predominantly a collective endeavor. So when you had the High Red Center, for example, the Japanese artist collective in 1964 that did their street cleaning event, it was a campaign that was carried out of a group to show the gentrification and the transformation that Tokyo was going through during the 1964 Summer Olympics. And it was really a collective effort. Further, you also have to understand this context where in Japan, Korea, China, and elsewhere, you had artist associations and artist memberships. So not anyone could become an artist. You couldn't just start painting and declare yourself an artist. So when, say, for example, the fourth group, when they held their famous coffin procession in Seoul, led by Korean artist Kim Gu Lim, they were really going against a certain system, a certain context that actually dictated how we understand and the language we use to define art. So there was a particular political, economic, and social environment in which these concepts were actually developed in these regions. And that was actually vastly different than what we saw in Euro-America. So in places such as Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan, I would say and argue that performance art emerged under things such as military dictatorships, post-cultural revolution, post-martial law in Taiwan, and you had the post-Allied occupation, respectively, in Japan. So there are reasons why performance histories from these eras are often enshrouded in obscurity, or that they resist a type of canonization. But I think it's important that we ask ourselves, as historians, as curators, as people interested in these histories, why were pioneering performance artists from these regions, for example, in South Korea and in China, such as Kim Gu Lim or Ma Lu Ming in China, why were they targeted and imprisoned by their respective governments? So there's an important reminder that there's some things that are deeply intertwined in these histories that are not so easily collected or canonized. And I see myself as being very much a student of the people who came before me, certain art historians, such as Kim Mi-kyung in Korea, Ho Kwang-soo, Kuro Daroji in Japan, Reiko Tomi, Yuri Mitsuda, Rong Rong, and so on in China. And another thing I would say, another reason why I would say that it cannot be collected, conserved, and so on, is that in my research, I've discovered that that live art, or what I often call socio-live art, or the socio-political live art, was very much imbued with a sense of the public sphere. That this emerged during the 1960s and 70s, where artists were using performance as a way of addressing social issues and injustices. So this is very much an interdisciplinary approach that actually combines things like the public sphere, activism, social commentary, the body. And it was very experimental, and it actually developed in public spaces and not galleries or museums. Again, this idea of the art making the work, the art making the artist. So it was actually before there were institutions of contemporary or modern art, there was the public sphere. And the public sphere actually gave the context for these types of practices to develop. And that is important to note when thinking about how does an institution, a late capitalist institution, now try to absorb such histories. And I mean, East Asia has had a very long history with live art and tradition, about using the body as a medium, rhythms, thinking about time. And you can think about the Talchum in Korea, or the Kabuki in Japan. In China, the Qishu, the traditional opera. And in fact, in my research, actually, it's quite funny. You can see people like the famous German playwright Brecht. He actually examines traditional Chinese theater in the 1960s. And it's funny, in his essays, you can see that he discovered and he observed that traditional Chinese theater does not utilize a concept of the fourth wall, right? That idea of a separation between stage and audience, between artist and viewer. But instead, in China, we traditionally use a much more immersive approach. So that really says a lot about the importance of an audience to this, and people in relation, right? This kind of interrelationship that's quite essential. Also, I might put forward that we have very different concepts about time and space in this region, very different than what you would find from the kind of European tradition. So, for example, I might put forward the idea of in Taoism, we have a concept called Chang Sun, and Chang Sun is the idea of an eternal now, right? It's the idea that the present moment is the only thing that exists. And in fact, that the past and the future and the present all exist simultaneously. And that this idea of time, or at least the way we understand it, the properties are very much in a kind of illusionary form, right? And of course, in Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, the idea of ephemerality, the idea of nothingness is a very old concept. In fact, you can find in the Heart Sutras, it says that form is emptiness and emptiness is form, right? So this idea of the nothing, of the void, was already an old ancient idea. And you can continue in the Tao. We have ideas of Wu Wei, which is the idea of non-action. This idea of actions, non-actions, not. So that's part of the first part of your question, and then perhaps the second part of your question, which is, what does it mean to conserve performance art? Well, I mean, what does it mean to take a multi-sensual 4-dimension experience and reduce it into a kind of a 1-dimensional plane in order for it to be kind of understood and shared again? That's a very good question. I think it's actually a good thing in some ways, because I think it can help lay the groundwork for decentralizing a certain narrow canon in art history, right? And I think that, and this is something that I found when developing the Institute of Asian Performance Arts. So, for instance, by tackling these questions, we might better understand why Yves Klein moved to Japan when he was 24 to study judo. And what exactly did he absorb when he was studying judo then later on returning to France to open his judo academy in Paris. And by studying these histories and these questions about conservation, we might better understand what was the impact of Zen philosophy, let's say, on the great American composer and artist John Cage. And how was Cage's work and the artists that followed under Cage, how were they influenced by John Cage, for example, attending the classes of people like Daitsu Suzuki at Columbia when Daitsu was giving lectures on Zen Buddhism? How can these histories help us better understand important female artists from the region, such as Kang Ja-jung from Korea, one of the early first female performance artists, and how can that help us better understand different perspectives on feminism in the region and how these perspectives differ from a Western approach? So I think it's in one form, these questions are a fight, I believe, against a certain cultural logic. And I think it's a fruitful one to have. But I think this is something that I'm also currently working through in my work and in my writings. And so this is how I would put forward my answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Victor. That's such a rich introduction to your thoughts on these topics. And of course, we do accept no for an answer. But I think we often find that I often find that when people say no to the question of whether performance can be conserved, what they often mean is not this way, but maybe that way. So I would want to ask about your work with the Institute of Asian Performance Art and ask you what you think can and can't be gleaned from the archive. What isn't preserved?
I think there's so many factors involved. Are the artists still alive, right? I think I'm a big believer in oral histories and oral traditions. And I believe in alternative forms of sharing of knowledge and information and alternative ways of thinking about historicizing, and not just performance art. So I received, for example, a lot of this information directly from the artist in an oral tradition. It was passed down to me. And then for me, I'm able to pass that down, the stories and narratives. However, you see the archive is predominantly built on a two-dimensional plane, which is the photograph or the paper document. And the photograph is certainly not the performance. And we can think about, the linguistic tools to help describe how we differentiate between documentation and the event and so on and so forth. However, I've had a very different approach when dealing with these things, which is to see if the artists are still alive, and some of them unfortunately are not. And so then who has the capacity to speak on their behalf? And what are the documents to support those narratives? So with the Institute, it was really an experimentation about these very questions. And we were able to invite artists like Lee Kong-yong, artists like Kim Koo-lim, She Da-shing to come themselves without the need for mediation, without the need for historical documentation to supplement or to counter. They were there in the flesh and they could dictate. They had the authority, the autonomy to do so. And there wasn't a group of curators surrounding them mediating. There wasn't an institution that had its own separate agendas and funders and geographical dispositions to kind of influence the trajectory of the work and how it was conceived or received. So that was one thing, right? But you could never say, at least from our experience, that whether you call it a remake, a revisiting, a reenactment, and even so, and we did these with the original artist. It wasn't like they were based on historical documents. No, we invited Kim Koo-lim to redo an original work from the 1970s for the first time in the United Kingdom. But because they had that capacity, it was still within his practice and his canon, and so he was still able to do so and open up a very rich conversation about how do we then pass this on, how do we then revisit it. But within the context, as I said, of many late capitalist institutions in the West, it is very complicated, and so that's the thing. It's not, it's very difficult to then go into an archive, because the very concept of an archive, as I said earlier, is already a type of construct, a way of historicizing, a way of approaching specific cultures, events, and people through a specific lens. And there's traditions and histories around that, and most of them are centered around certain geographies in the West. So therefore, when I take an oral tradition or other types of traditions, it's in fact to subvert those very notions. So I hesitate when we take the archive as the precedence in order to then filter other histories through and then pose questions. I think we need to be very cautious of that, or at least be mindful of what we're doing, and then be honest about what we're doing and how it's being done to the audience. And so I think in the way, and of course I'm rambling, what I tend to do, but I think it's, in a way, it becomes in the realm of education. It becomes in a way of sharing information, not in a way of hierarchy, right? Because I think hierarchy is very dangerous. And I believe that the archive and collections create natural forms of hierarchy. And so how can we share on a horizontal plane these informations and have individuals contest and create a kind of and co-develop sense of what was occurring or sharing?
Thank you. I'd also like
Thank
to
you.
ask you, you mentioned in several places the importance of the public sphere and the importance of kind of collective action in many sort of important performance moments in East Asia, Pirate Center and others. And I'd like to ask you, as a curator, how you see, if you see ways of bringing that element, that public element, the importance of the cultural situation and the public situation, into a contemporary exhibition, whether or not there are live performances in the show.
So again, this depends on because I think I'm not one to generalize or to create a standard model that we can then apply to every situation. And I think that's the first thing to kind of reconsider. Then after you can reconsider that, you would have to say, again, are these artists still alive? Are there people that hold the traditions and values that are still able to speak to the truth? And not, and because there's degrees of separation, degrees of mediation that occur when you create an exhibition. And then of course there's the reduction of that information so that it's transmissible between a general public. And that is also a thing that we encounter in our industry, where we have to take very complex socio-political and cultural ideas, filter them down into very simple notions for a general public, which, that comes with its own complications. I tend to think it's about education, and not necessarily just through visual display. I think the exhibition is one format, but if you look at what we tried to do with the Institute of Asian Performance Art, we took multi-platforms. So we were invited to do an exhibition, and then we responded by saying, okay, why don't we do free classes with local universities? We'll do a publication specifically on the history of East Asian performance art, and we'll do a visual display of some of the elements and documentations from the archives and artists alongside artworks. So we took a multi-platform approach to give some justice to the complexity of the situation. However, you will never be able to encapsulate the complexity of the public sphere, say, in a communist country or within a socio-political context where you cannot just go outside and do what you want or say what you want. Those have very different implications, but those are as real as gravity, right? You have to respect those laws and forces that are invisible, but they're very much influencing the development of visual culture within these areas. So again, I think it's about educating. I think it's about sharing these different types of contexts and allowing for these stories to exist for what they are, but also to, and I think, as I said, to off-center, to disbalance, to provide something that runs tangential and parallel. And I think that this is quite important. So I believe in these kind of alternative formats and multi-platform perspectives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.